For 3 years, Nigerians have been asking one question over and over and getting no straight answer. Fuel subsidy is gone. So where did the money go? This week in Abuja, the Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Taiwo Oyedele, finally answered it. And what makes his answer remarkable is not what he said the money was spent on, it is that he agreed the question was fair. In his own words, there was a question about the subsidy savings, where has it gone to? He had heard this question so many times and, quote, guess what, it is a valid question, end quote. Then he gave the answer. The savings went on servicing government debt, on paying off the ways and means obligations at the central bank, on funding the new national minimum wage, on the student loan scheme, on social intervention programs, and a large part of it, he explained, was swallowed by interest rates that climbed from around 8% to as high as 24%. He also promised something this government has never produced in 3 years, a published detailed breakdown of the savings and how every naira was spent, and he said it would come within days. Today, we're going to walk through why the subsidy was removed, what Nigerians were promised, exactly what the minister has now said, and why so many people still do not feel it. Stay with me. If you're new to the Policy Pulse HQ, welcome. We follow the money, verify the facts, and hold power accountable. Subscribe now and join thousands of Nigerians who want more than headlines. Watch the full investigation on this channel because the short only tells half the story. The decision and the promise. To judge this fairly, you have to go back to the beginning, because the case for removal was serious and it deserves to be stated properly before anybody criticizes what followed. On May the 29th, 2023, in his inaugural address, President Bola Tinubu declared that fuel subsidy is gone. That single sentence ended a policy that had shaped Nigerian public finance for decades. It was followed shortly afterwards by the unification of the foreign exchange market, and together those two decisions marked the start of the most sweeping fiscal shift this country has seen in a generation. The argument for removal was straightforward. The minister has now put a figure on the scale of it, saying that the fuel subsidy, combined with what he described as an implicit subsidy on foreign exchange, was costing Nigeria roughly 5% of gross domestic product before the reforms. 5% of everything this economy produces going out every year on two subsidies. Beyond the cost, there were 3 long-standing criticisms. The subsidy disproportionately benefited wealthier Nigerians who own vehicles rather than the poorest who do not. It fueled large-scale smuggling to neighboring countries where fuel sold for far more. And it was widely believed to be riddled with inflated claims that were extremely difficult to audit. Then there is the part of the story that gets forgotten, and the minister raised it directly this week. Before the reforms, the government was financing a great deal of its spending by creating money through ways and means advances from the central bank. Interest rates were around 8%. The national minimum wage was 30,000 naira. That was the machinery holding the old arrangement together, and printing money to fund government is a decision that eventually presents its bills somewhere else in the economy, usually as inflation. So the case was real. What Nigerians then wanted to know was simple. If the country stops spending that money on petrol, what does it get instead? The bargain as it was understood in markets, in danfos, in classrooms and in living rooms across this country was a trade. Nigerians would absorb higher fuel prices, higher transport costs and higher food prices, and in exchange the money freed up would come back to them as things they could see. Better roads, working hospitals, functioning schools, reliable power, direct support for the poorest households while the pain lasted. That expectation was not invented by the public. It was the natural reading of the argument being made for removal, which was that subsidy money was being wasted on something inefficient and could be spent on something better. And the pain was real. Petrol prices multiplied. Transport fares rose across every route in the country. Food inflation followed, because in Nigeria, almost everything you eat has traveled by road. Households that were already stretched found themselves cutting meals, cutting school runs, cutting travel home. So the reasonable expectation was reciprocity. If a family is asked to absorb that, it expects to be shown what its sacrifice bought. 3 years on, most Nigerians will tell you they have not been shown. That is the honest starting point for everything the minister said this week. The answer, in his own terms. Let us go carefully through what was said this week at the Africa Emerging Markets Forum in Abuja, because the minister's explanation is more coherent than his critics allow, and more incomplete than his supporters admit. First, on debt. He said interest rates rose sharply and that instead of paying around 8% on Nigeria's debt, the country is paying as high as 24%. And then a line worth repeating exactly because it explains the priority. He said that when you need to service debts, you do not debate whether you need to pay. You pay, and you pay on time. Second, on ways and means. He explained that a significant portion of the savings went to settling the government's obligations from the years of money creation. His formulation was blunt. If you stop printing money, the spending does not disappear. You need to finance the money you are printing before, and that was part of where the savings went. Third, the social spending. The savings funded the implementation of the new national minimum wage, which replaced the old 30,000 naira floor. They funded the student loan scheme. They funded expanded social intervention programs aimed at vulnerable Nigerians and salary obligations across government. Fourth, and this is the framing that matters most, he argued that the reforms were never primarily about generating a pot of cash. They were about removing distortions in the economy and reducing risk, and much of the savings did not translate into visible improvements precisely because they went to obligations that are invisible by their nature. He also defended the reforms against the backdrop of the International Monetary Fund's 2026 Article 4 assessment, saying the fund's review reinforces the difficult decisions taken. And then the commitment. He said the government owed Nigerians an explanation, that a detailed analysis would be published within days, and that this is what transparency looks like. The admission hidden inside the defense. Now here is what almost every headline this week has missed, and it is the single most important sentence in the story. Strip the minister's explanation down to its structure, and what he has confirmed is this. The savings from fuel subsidy removal were largely absorbed by higher debt servicing costs and increased government spending. Read that again as a Nigerian household would read it. The money did not vanish, and nobody is alleging it was stolen, but it also never arrived anywhere a citizen could touch it. It went to creditors, to the central bank, to wage bills, to obligations the government already owed. Those are all legitimate uses of public money, and a government that failed to service its debt would inflict far worse damage on this same population. But notice what that means for the bargain from Section 3. Nigerians were asked to absorb the cost of removal on the understanding that the freed money would come back to them as visible things. What the minister has now confirmed is that it largely went to closing holes that already existed before the removal. That is not the same trade, and pretending it is the same trade is what has fueled disappointment. The government's case. The strongest defense of this administration's position runs as follows, and it is not a weak argument. Debt service is not optional. A country that misses payments faces downgrades, higher future borrowing costs, and a currency crisis, and every one of those outcomes lands hardest on the poorest households, not on the officials making the decisions. When rates move from 8% to 24%, the bill grows regardless of what anyone in Abuja wants. Supporters also point out that ending ways and means financing is genuine reform because printing money to fund government is one of the most direct routes to inflation there is, and the household paying more for Gary today would have paid more still under the old arrangement. On this reading, the savings were not wasted, they were spent preventing a worse crisis that never happened, and prevented crises are invisible by definition. The critics' case. The counter-argument is equally serious. Critics ask why 3 years on, the government is still promising a breakdown rather than presenting one, and note that the demand is not new. In January 2025, the then Minister of Finance was questioned in the Senate over exactly this, over how much had been saved and how it had been spent, and the session moved behind closed doors. They also point out that if the savings were consumed by pre-existing obligations, that raises a question about the original case for removal, which was argued to the public as a redirection of spending toward better uses. And they set the reassurance against what Nigerians actually see. Same power supply, same roads, same hospitals, higher prices. On this reading, the explanation may be accurate and still fail the test that matters, which is whether ordinary people got anything back. So what does this actually mean for an ordinary Nigerian household? 3 things, and they are practical rather than theoretical. The first is that nobody should expect a windfall. If the savings are going to debt service, wages, and existing obligations, then there is no hidden pot waiting to be released into roads and hospitals. And any politician who promises you otherwise between now and 2027 is not being straight with you. The second is that debt service costs are now the thing to watch, not the subsidy. At 24% borrowing costs, the share of national revenue going to creditors determines how much is left for everything else you use. That single ratio will shape your life more than any speech. The third is that the promised breakdown gives you something you have not had for 3 years, which is a document to hold people to. If it arrives, read it. If it does not arrive, that silence is itself an answer. Here is where this leaves us, and I want to be fair to everybody in it. The Minister of Finance has done something his predecessors avoided. He acknowledged the question was legitimate, gave a substantive answer, and committed to publishing the figures. That deserves acknowledgement rather than mockery. But an explanation is not a receipt. Everything said this week was said at a podium, and the document that would let Nigerians verify any of it has been promised within days, 3 years after the policy began. Until that publication exists, what we have is a credible account that nobody outside the government can check. So the honest conclusion is this. The money was not necessarily wasted, and it was very likely not stolen. But on the minister's own account, it went to obligations rather than to anything Nigerians can see, touch, or drive on. Whether that was the right choice in a country this stretched is a legitimate political argument, and reasonable people land on both sides of it. What is not arguable is that after 3 years of sacrifice, the receipts are owed. Now, I want to hear from you, and I mean this seriously. Do you accept the explanation, or do you want the numbers first? Tell me in the comments, and tell me one thing in your own life that has actually improved since May 2023, or one thing that has not. I read every one of them. Like this video, subscribe to the Policy Pulse HQ, and I will see you in the next one.